In today's lesson, we will be talking about the process of gas exchange. At the end of the video, you are expected to achieve the following learning targets. And to guide you with the discussion, we have the following topics outlined as follows. Gas exchange or respiration is the process that supplies body cells with oxygen from the environment and deliver waste carbon dioxide from cells to the environment. Notice in the figure that oxygen and carbon dioxide move between the bloodstream and the lungs through simple diffusion. Recall that simple diffusion is a type of passive transport wherein molecules can move freely through a membrane from an area of high concentration to low concentration without assistance from proteins. There are two types of gas exchange, the external and internal respiration. In external respiration, it's the exchange of gases that occurs between the external environment and the lungs, while internal respiration is the gas exchange happening within the cells of the body. During external respiration, exchange of gases occur between the air and the blood within the lungs. From here, the blood will then transport oxygen from the lungs to the underlying tissues in the body. On the other hand, during internal respiration, exchange of gases occur between the blood and the body cells through an interstitial fluid. This is a fluid that fills the spaces between the cells. After delivering oxygen, the blood picks up carbon dioxide, then transport this back to the lungs and out of the body during exhalation. Gases enter and leave the animal body by diffusing across a thin moist layer of cells called the respiratory surface. Organisms vary in the kind of respiratory surface that they have. In humans and other terrestrial vertebrates, the respiratory surface is in the lungs, but other animals use different surfaces which we will identify in a little while. Regardless of what type, all of these structures share three characteristics. First, each respiratory surface consists of a thin, moist membrane across which oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse. The respiratory surface is thin because gases diffuse quickly only over very short distances. And it must be moist because a gas can only diffuse across the plasma membrane of a cell when it is in a solution. Second, its surface area must be relatively large. The greater the area of a respiratory surface, the more molecules can cross the surface at once. And third, the rate of diffusion in a respiratory surface varies in air and in water. Air and water have different properties as respiratory media. Aquatic animals have to expend more energy to obtain oxygen compared to terrestrial animals that obtain oxygen through the atmosphere. To explain further how air and water affect respiration, let us consider the following figure. Water is more viscous than air. So moving oxygen over a respiratory surface exposed to water requires more effort than moving it over air. In addition, a volume of water holds much less oxygen than a volume of air. Finally, changes in water temperature and flow rate also affect oxygen availability. For example, warm water holds less oxygen than cold water. In terms of water movement, rapidly moving water tends to contain more dissolved oxygen, whereas stagnant water contains less. That is why when water temperature rises or moving water becomes stagnant, aquatic species that have high oxygen needs may suffocate. One example of this is the event of fish kill, or the sudden and unexpected death of aquatic animals in a short period of time. Fish kills are commonly caused by suffocation due to the lack of dissolved oxygen. We now identify examples of respiratory surfaces that different animals use. In simple animals like Hydra, every cell in the body is close enough to the external environment that gases can diffuse quickly between any cell and the environment. For earthworms, the skin serves as a respiratory organ. Dense network of capillaries between the skin facilitates the exchange of gases. Since earthworms are terrestrial invertebrates, they keep their body surface moist by secreting a mucus. Insects have a system of air tubes called tracheae, through which oxygen is delivered directly to the cells without entering the blood. Air sacs located near the wings, legs, and abdomen acts as bellows to help move the air into the tubes through external openings called the spiracles. Most aquatic organisms have gills, which are highly folded structures containing blood vessels that exchange gases with water across a thin layer of epithelium. Gills occur in some vertebrates such as fishes and amphibians, and in invertebrates such as mollusks. Lastly, as vertebrates ventured onto the land hundreds of millions of years ago, gills became useless because they dry up when exposed to air. Instead, terrestrial habitats selected for lungs, which are sac-like organs that exchange gases. The location of lungs inside the body helps keep the respiratory surfaces moist. We now go to ventilation. Organisms rely on ventilation to maintain high oxygen and low carbon dioxide concentrations. The process that ventilates lungs is breathing, the alternating inhalation and exhalation of air. For this section, we compare the mechanisms by which amphibians, birds, and mammals fill their lungs with air. An amphibian, such as a frog, ventilates its lungs by positive pressure breathing, which is inflation of the lungs with forced airflow. Inhalation begins when the floor of an amphibian's oral cavity is lowered, drawing in air through its nostrils. Next, with the nostrils and the mouth closed, the floor of the oral cavity rises, forcing air down the trachea. And exhalation follows as air is expelled by the recoil of the lungs and by compression of the muscular body wall. Sometimes, this breathing cycle is disrupted when male frogs puff themselves up in aggressive or courtship displays because they take in air several times without allowing any release. Meanwhile, ventilation in birds is highly efficient. This is because breathing occurs in one direction only, thus avoiding mixing of inhaled and exhaled air. The first inhalation draws fresh air into the posterior air sacs. During the first exhalation, this fresh air moves from posterior air sacs through tiny tubes in the lungs. The lining of these tubes is the bird's respiratory surface. During the second inhalation, the air that was in the lungs moves into anterior air sacs. And finally, air exits these air sacs during the second exhalation. Mammals employ a negative pressure breathing. To understand how a mammal breathes, think about filling a syringe. By pulling back on the plunger, you lower the pressure in the syringe, drawing gas or fluid through the needle into the syringe chamber. Similarly, mammals employ negative pressure breathing, that is, pulling rather than pushing air onto their lungs. Now pay attention to your own breathing for a moment. Each respiratory cycle consists of one inhalation and one exhalation. Each time you inhale, air moves onto the lungs, and when you exhale, air flows out of the lungs. In humans, the diaphragm is a muscle that divides the upper thoracic cavity or chest from the lower abdominal cavity of the body. When we inhale, the muscles of the diaphragm and rib cage contract, expanding the chest cavity. The chest cavity therefore has lower air pressure than the atmosphere, so air moves into the lungs. And when we exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and the rib cage lowers, reversing the process and pushing air out of the lungs. A respiratory pigment is any molecule that increases the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. The oxygen carrying capacity is simply the amount of oxygen the red blood cells in our blood can carry to our tissues and organs. There are four major classifications of respiratory pigments: hemoglobin, which is in red color, hemocyanin, that is in blue color, chlorocruorin in green, and hemothyrin, that is violet to pink in color. In humans and most other vertebrates, the most common respiratory pigment is a protein called hemoglobin. Oxygen that enters the blood diffuses into the red blood cells where it binds to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein consisting of 4 polypeptide units, each with an iron-containing heme group that can bind to one molecule of oxygen. Because there are about 250 million hemoglobin molecules in each red blood cell can carry at least 1 billion molecules of oxygen. In this section, we discuss respiratory system. The human respiratory system includes all the structures that conduct air in a continuous pathway to and from the lungs. The function of the respiratory system is summarized as follows. Likewise, the overview of the system will be presented in the next slide. So air from the nostrils enters the nasal cavity, where it is warmed and moistened. From here, it flows next into the pharynx or the throat. It continues to the larynx, which is a short airway commonly known as the voice box because it contains a pair of vocal cords. The vocal cords vibrate as air from the lungs passes through a slit-like opening called the glottis. The larynx also directs food towards the esophagus. During swallowing, a cartilage flap called the epiglottis covers the glottis so that food enters the esophagus and not the lungs. Beneath the larynx is the trachea or the windpipe. Cilia and mucus coat the trachea's inside surface, trapping debris and moistening the incoming air. The trachea branches into two bronchi, one leading to each lung. The bronchi branch finely and repeatedly, extending into what we call a bronchiole. Blood vessels called pulmonary capillaries wrap around the alveoli where gas exchange occurs. Oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse through thin walls of the alveoli and the neighboring capillaries. We now discuss the coordination of gas exchange with that of circulation. During inhalation, the high concentration of oxygen will diffuse to the blood that is flowing through the alveolar capillaries. Oxygenated blood, which appears here in red, leaves the lungs through pulmonary vein and goes to the heart where it is pumped into the systemic circuit. In the systemic capillaries, oxygen diffuses out of the blood and carbon dioxide is picked up. Having unloaded the oxygen and loaded the carbon dioxide, the blood will return to the heart and be pumped back again to the lungs. There, exchange occurs across the alveolar capillaries, resulting in exhaled air enriched in carbon dioxide. Let us now describe some adaptations that facilitate respiratory function in a low oxygen environment. Air at high altitudes provide less oxygen than air at low altitudes. Decreased air pressure means that less oxygen is available for breathing. Animals and humans that live at a high altitude have adaptations that facilitate the uptake of oxygen. One example of this are the llamas that live at a high altitude, which have hemoglobin that is unusually good at binding oxygen when the oxygen concentration is low. On the other hand, water pressure increases with depth. Animals that make long dives have adaptations that allow them to store oxygen and to shift the distribution of blood flow during a dive. To summarize the major points of the lesson, gases diffuse across respiratory surfaces. Some organisms exchange gases across the body wall, some have gills that exchange gases with water, and some exchange gases in lungs. The human respiratory system delivers air into the lungs. The nose, pharynx, and larynx form the upper respiratory tract, and the lower respiratory tract consists of the trachea and the lungs. Breathing requires pressure changes in the lungs. A respiratory cycle consists of one inhalation and one exhalation. And finally, blood delivers oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. In the lungs, hemoglobin binds oxygen and releases carbon dioxide for exhalation. At the body's other tissues, the concentration of oxygen is low, so oxygen diffuses out of the blood and into the respiring cells. Carbon dioxide moves into the opposite direction along its concentration gradient. That would be all for today's video. If you have any questions, write them down in your exit tickets. Thank you so much for listening.